Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, Purpose-Driven Board Leadership, Reconceiving Foundation Governance. We are extremely excited to have you all here. We have a huge crowd and audience. So what we would first like to ask you to do is be involved. We would love to hear any questions or comments that you may have. We'll be monitoring those, so just feel free to put those into the chat or the Q&A functions down there, and Sarah at CEP and myself will be monitoring those and making sure that our hosts get relevant questions and we can answer those for you. Like I said, we've got a ton of folks on the line, so if we don't get to your specific question, we will try to get to it as a broad question that probably a lot of people also are interested in asking. So thank you all so much for joining us. I also want to let you know that we will be sending out a recording of this webinar. There are no slides today, so you will not be getting any slides because you wouldn't need those because they would be blank. But we will send those out, maybe not today, but in the next couple of days, you will get those from us as a follow-up. Feel free to share a copy of this recording widely. We want to get this information out there. We're really excited about the conversation today. And first off, really excited to have Phil Buchanan with us, the president of Center for Effective Philanthropy. And I have talked too much already, and I'm going to let these fine individuals introduce themselves in a moment. But with that being said, Phil, over to you.
Andy, thank you so much. And the Center for Effective Philanthropy is so excited to be a part of this BoardSource CEP joint production. And I'm really honored to be here with my friend Wallestad, who I think is just such an important leader in our sector. BoardSource is such an important organization. We are going to be joined in a little bit by two other really wonderful leaders, both of whom I've had the privilege of knowing for literally decades. Kofi Appenteng, who, among other things, is the president and CEO of the Africa America Institute. He is a member of the Hilton Foundation board and has had other important foundation board roles, including at the Ford Foundation. And of course, also Jim Canales, whose title is president and trustee of the Barr Foundation. I'll say a little bit more about each of them when I welcome them, but Jim is one of the most thoughtful people when it comes to the topic of foundation governance. But I want to start by talking with you, Ann, and it's great to see you. And great to see that we have so many people on this webinar, which I think is just really a testament to the power and influence of your great article, The 4 Principles of Purpose-Driven Board Leadership, which I have said to you before, and I mean it, is the best piece on nonprofit governance that I've ever seen. And I want to start, I think, by just asking you to talk about the article and what motivated you to write it. I guess I can guess because you have some serious concerns that you sort of lead off with about nonprofit boards. Today, you describe them as preoccupied with fundraising, disconnected from communities and the people that they serve, ill-informed about ecosystems in which they operate, lacking in racial and ethnic diversity. Other than that, they're doing great. What was it, that sense of frustration with sort of the status quo, that motivated you to write this article? Tell us a little bit about where you're coming from.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And thank you, Phil, for your friendship and your partnership on this session. It's really, I'm so excited to be having this conversation. So thank you. In terms of the impetus for writing the article, and I should say right off the bat that, you know, I'm the author, you know, in terms of the name listed, but this really was a team effort, and really our thinking as a BoardSource team built on the thinking of many, many others. So I think, you know, it's thrilling that folks are engaging with the article and appreciating the perspectives that we're putting out there in terms of what we think is important in terms of shift. But, you know, at least from my perspective, it's less brand new idea and more synthesis of important things that many others have been lifting up for a long, long time. I think from the BoardSource perspective, in terms of why it felt important to call for a shift, it really centers on a long-held BoardSource belief that boards have to be strategic bodies, and that boards that deprioritize or undervalue the strategic role and instead focus solely on oversight, or in the case of non-grant making nonprofits, fundraising or investment strategy, that they are doing so at the risk of organizational effectiveness and resilience. And it builds on that core belief and argues that for boards to bring really relevance, accountability, and integrity to that strategic role, they must have knowledge and insights about the work that the organization does and the community that it seeks to serve. And as you alluded to, based on BoardSource's research and the research of many others, we know of the stats I'm going to cite here, our BoardSource's research. We know that boards are, as you said, disconnected from the communities and people that they serve. Half of the boards that we surveyed in our most recent study said that they did not have the board members that they needed to establish trust with the communities that they serve. We know that boards are themselves saying that they are ill-informed about the ecosystems in which they're operating. So only 25% of boards said that they had that their board had knowledge of the organization's work or field as a high priority in board recruitment. We know that boards are lacking in racial and ethnic diversity. Not only are boards overwhelmingly white, and 78% of board members, according to our research, are white, but 19% of boards are all white. So there is an extreme lack of racial and ethnic diversity, and organizations themselves are reporting that that is negatively impacting them in terms of the work that they're trying to do. And as you mentioned, preoccupied with fundraising above all else. So we asked boards, what's most important in terms of the roles that your board plays and the way in which you recruit. 70% of chief executives said that fundraising was very important, and that was well above many, many other areas of board function, including thinking strategically as a board. So you put those things together and you ask yourself, how could this be? How could boards be operating in this way? And I think, at least from my perspective, what the data don't do is explain, why is that? How is it that boards can really tolerate or withstand this tremendous disconnection from the work of their institutions and the people in the communities that they seek to serve? And that's really where our direct engagement in conversation and dialogue and work with boards was so illuminating. And particularly the work that we have been doing for many years now in terms of trying to challenge boards to think differently about public policy and advocacy, to think more expansively about partnership and opportunities for collaboration, to push themselves as it relates to diversity, inclusion, and equity. And we were hearing quite consistently in those conversations that too many boards just aren't centered on their role as a strategic body. And so it actually felt confusing to them to understand why BoardSource was talking about the importance of all of these things, because it was but isn't the board here to do X? And so we really began to think about what needed to shift to be able to drive a different way of being for boards. And what emerged was an understanding that we really needed to do two things. One, we needed to shift the way that boards understand their most essential work in a way that centers strategy and direction setting. And then to follow up on that or build on that, we needed to articulate the mindset shifts that needed to happen to position boards to be able to do that strategic work well and with integrity. And so, that's a very long answer, but our diagnosis was that it was something very, very fundamental that needed to change. And that was the genesis of the thinking around purpose-driven board leadership.
That's great. Thank you. And you're focusing, as the article does, on nonprofit boards. And obviously we're going to segue in this conversation to talking about foundation boards, where one question we'll want to come back to, I think, is if foundation boards, private foundations, for example, are not fundraising, which they're not, then does this same analysis still apply? But before we get to that,
Mhm.
let's just go deeper on what this sort of framework is that you're advocating for nonprofit boards to think about, and I guess really push on this question of what it means to be purpose driven. And I can imagine, notwithstanding the statistics that you just cited, where folks seem relatively clear-eyed about some of their shortcomings, that people would say, well, of course, we're purpose-driven. We're all about the mission. And we're focused on the mission of the organization. You make a sort of distinction between mission and purpose. And you say it's not just semantics. Can you explain that?
Yeah. I think it's really about where the board is centered. And sort of the question or the distinction between, is it about the organization or the institution, and the underlying assumption that if you're advancing the organization, then you are advancing the public good. That's what I would call or consider to be a more traditional board frame. And what purpose-driven board leadership is arguing for is really a shift so that it is about the social good purpose that the organization or institution seeks to advance, and the way that the organization operates to advance that social good purpose. So I would describe it as a shift from stewardship of organization to stewardship of purpose. And I think that distinction it also speaks to some of the points that I made around duty of loyalty, and loyalty to what? And that, so it is not a hard right or a hard left away from mission. In fact, you would hope that those would largely feel the same. But I think it's a not insignificant distinction in terms of the lens through which you deliberate and make decisions.
Well, let's maybe go into some examples of how so. So walk us through the four principles of purpose-driven board leadership, and maybe what it would mean to actually be operating in a way that's consistent with those principles, and how that would be different than some of what you're observing.
Yeah. So the four principles, just really quickly, number one is purpose before organization, which is really saying that it's about prioritizing the organization's purpose versus the organization itself. So that's what we were just talking about. The second one is respect for ecosystem. So an acknowledgement that an organization's actions can positively or negatively impact its surrounding ecosystem, and encouraging boards, challenging boards to commit to being a respectful and responsible ecosystem player. So understanding that they don't operate in a vacuum, and the things that they do have an impact just as the things around them impact them. The third principle is equity mindset. So encouraging organizations to make a commitment to advancing equitable outcomes, and to interrogating and avoiding the ways in which an organization's strategies and work might reinforce systemic inequities. And then the fourth principle, obviously these are all kind of interdependent and mutually reinforcing, is authorized voice and power. So the recognition that organizational power and voice must be authorized by those impacted by the organization's work. So I think about, you asked about what does it really mean? What does that shift to purpose-driven board leadership really mean? I think it's about different questions. And that probably sounds like an oversimplification, but I really think that is what it's about. So, a traditional board might ask, what have we accomplished? And applying the concept of ecosystem and, in some ways, equity mindset and authorized voice and power, a purpose-driven board might ask, what did we make possible as a result of our commitment and partnership with others? It's a different way at, a sort of similar sense of understanding, but a completely different frame in terms of how you see your organization's role. Another example that's, sort of similar principles at play, the distinction between who are our competitors and who is operating within our ecosystem, and how does our work complement each other. What a different conversation you have when you start with those two different questions. So, there are more examples of that, but I think that's probably a good way to be thinking about what does this shift really look like, and how does board conversation start to shift when it's asking different questions.
Yeah, that's great. And I think I've shared with you that I've had experience in nonprofit boardrooms of the word competitor, being used to describe organizations whose missions and purposes were very consistent with the organization whose board was then using the word competitor to describe, wait, aren't we going after the same thing and we just have different roles in getting there? Do we really want to beat them? Is that what we're saying? So that definitely resonates for me. I don't know how much you thought about foundations when you were working on this piece. And I guess there's two elements of that I would love for you to touch on. One is, what can foundations do to either impede or facilitate a nonprofit board having a purpose lens? And then the second, which is really where we're going to shift in a minute to spend the bulk of our time, is does this apply to foundations, and if so, how? But if you could start with the first one, and then we'll go to the second one, and then we'll bring in our other two panelists.
Sure. So short answer to both questions, yes. Yes, I think that there is relevance to foundation boards, even though that wasn't, as you said, who I was speaking to most directly in the article. And yes, I think that there are things that foundation staff can do that creates an environment or creates a context in which their nonprofit partners are more able or more likely to operate in a purpose-driven board way. And I think actually on that point, it comes back to different questions. So just as we're encouraging boards to ask different questions about, how do we think about our impact? How do we think about our role? How do we think about our place in the world, in service to whom and for what reason? I think that foundation staff, in partnership with grantees or potential grantees, can also ask different questions, so that it is less, how are you unique from others, or why are you, or how are you best at whatever it is that you do, or to what extent are you garnering attention or profile? Those are questions that really encourage an organization to think about themselves as though they are the center of their universe, and as though they have to prove, sort of how they are a lone operator, instead of how they are a part of an ecosystem that is doing important things together. And it's a subtle, but I think very significant shift in the way that a grantee or potential grantee shows up in response to those questions. And I think it creates the space for nonprofit leaders to think of themselves in relationship to a grant maker and to their colleague organizations in a really different way, instead of, we might work together, but when it comes down to the dollars, we fight. So I think that it's not insignificant.
Thanks. And then, so let's turn now to foundations. And I'm going to ask Jim and Kofi to join us. And again, if you joined a little bit late, Kofi Appenteng is president and CEO of the Africa America Institute, which has a mission of promoting enlightened engagement between Africa and America through education, training, and dialogue. And he has also served on many boards, including the Ford Foundation, which I think for a time he chaired, as well as the Hilton Foundation. And Jim Canales, again, president and trustee of the Barr Foundation for the last 7 years, I believe, almost to the day. And then prior to that, was, of course, the CEO of the James Irvine Foundation, has also himself served on other foundation boards. So Jim and Kofi, thank you so much for joining this discussion. And I think I'd like to start with you, Kofi, and then I'll turn to you, Jim, for just the quick take. What was your reaction to Anne's piece when you read it, and then we'll get into some of the specifics.
Thank you, Phil, and it's good to see you again, Anne and Jim. My take is that it's actually the best article on governance that I've read, just broadly on governance. It's really, I think, a fresh framing, and it's really interesting, and it's really useful. So there are just many things that it causes one to think differently about, that I think are really helpful to effectiveness of an organization.
Great.
Thank you.
Do you want me to go, Phil?
Yeah.
To build on Kofi's points. So greetings, everybody. Pleasure to be with everyone. And at the risk of sounding like a mutual admiration society, and I think Kofi and I can attest that we were not invited, having made those statements, but I too agree that it is a superb article. I know Phil has already sort of shared his view on it, and I think it has the potential to be a game changer in terms of how we think about governance. So I want to thank Anne, and I know she would be the first to say, and her colleagues, for the work that they did to shape and frame this idea. I had just three high-level takeaways in reading the article that I think are worthy of discussion today. One is just how inextricably connected this shift from organization to purpose is to the conversations we're all having about equity in our boardrooms right now. And I feel that those conversations are very much linked. So it's not only a great article, but it's a great article in a moment in time. The second is, I think it's such a wonderful invitation for those of us in boardrooms or those of us leading organizations to think about ways that we can broaden our horizons, kind of expand our vistas, think beyond the somewhat narrow ways that we tend to think about our work and our governance. And then the last point I'd make, that I know Anne made in her article, but I want to amplify it, is that this work can be evolutionary. This is not, to implement what Anne described in her framework does not require you're going in a wholesale resetting of the way you do governance. There are ways to do this in an evolutionary way, and I hope we'll explore that today. So it's a pleasure to be with everyone and looking forward to the conversation.
That's great. I appreciate so much those opening comments, and let's get into some particulars. So if we think about purpose before organization, let's talk about it in the context of a hotly debated question, which is, what should the spending level, the payout level for grants be? Do you think, Kofi, that this frame has implications for answering that question? And if so, what do you think they are?
Yeah, I think there are some significant implications, because if you are thinking purely from an institutional standpoint, then you're really looking to have a spending policy that kind of tries to maximize your endowment size over time. Would be, I think, would be the temptation, right? And to say that if we can become bigger and a bigger endowment, have more money, then we'll be able to do more good over time. But it leaves you forgetting that maybe you might be shortchanging the current world, which has significant challenges. And your purpose as an organization is to really try to work to address those, some of those challenges. And I think it's going to shift you to think much more aggressively about when you see opportunity, especially in concert with others, that it might cause you to push it a little harder, spend a little more, invest a little more today when there's a particular opportunity.
Thanks, Kofi. Ann or Jim, any thoughts on this?
I just would build on Kofi's point, not so much on the payout question, which I think is absolutely a key manifestation of this, but I want to go back to something Ann said in her opening, which I loved, and I saw that Jacob noted this in the chat too, that this is about stewardship of purpose over stewardship of organization. And I think the article invites those of us in foundations to think about how many of our processes, systems, procedures, payout regulations are guided by protecting and preserving our institutions, as opposed to what is best for the organizations and the issues that we are looking to advance. I think payout is the most prominent, because arguably you can make the case that all the conversation about intergenerational equity and preservation of spending power and all of that really doesn't matter when, you know, Rome is burning and we have things that we need to deal with. But I think it also even gets down to some of the micro. You know, I have been in way too many meetings where conversations quickly turn, well, we do it that way because that's what our auditors want. We do it that way because that's what the IRS requires. We do it that way because that's what a board member thinks we should be doing. And when you really interrogate a lot of that, you realize foundations have a lot more flexibility than sometimes they think they have, and certainly than they actually do have. So I think interrogating all of that in this context is so important. And I think, again, Ann's article does a great job of inviting us to engage in that interrogation process.
Yeah, I'd add the lawyers to that list too, as if what the lawyers advise is the law, which it isn't always. It's sometimes just their advice.
And Phil, they're often guided by what they think you want them to give you as an answer.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Ann, any reflections on this?
I think that's brilliant. And I would just add that I don't think that it prescribes an answer to these questions, but I think it creates space to frame the questions differently. And that, I think, is the significant shift.
So we're already really talking, I think, in a way about the second principle, which is respect for ecosystem. Because, Jim, one of the sort of implications of this is negative impact on nonprofit organizations, right? So if you were to just step back, and this is really putting you on the spot, and think about foundations generally and the degree to which they respect the ecosystem in which they operate, what would your take be? How are they doing?
You know, I think oftentimes when we think about foundations respecting the ecosystem, we quickly turn to a conversation about how foundations work in conjunction with their partners, with their grantees, with their grant seekers. We think about that as being a key part of the ecosystem, which it is in terms of the transactional nature of our work. But I also think that the ecosystem in which we work in philanthropy is so much broader than that. It is about the public sector. It is about the private sector, which is often kind of an ignored piece of this conversation. Right. And I think thinking in that bigger picture way is so important. And again, why I think this article does such a nice job, because it really invites us to be more expansive as we think about things. And as I thought about this ecosystem question, I was reflecting on something that just recently happened for us at Barr that I wanted to share, because I think it's a good illustration of some of the principles that Ann talks about. Back in January, and last year, as many foundations did, we did a lot in response to COVID, and a lot of foundations really stepped up, put resources out to respond to emergencies. As we moved into January, we started thinking at Barr about what are we going to do about vaccine, and at the time we were calling it vaccine hesitancy. We were reading all about vaccine hesitancy, concerns about it, et cetera. And we pulled together a group of funders, and the group of funders that came together to talk about how we wanted to address this issue locally did some things that I think were kind of uncharacteristic for us. One, we didn't worry about who was leading what, who was taking credit for what. We worried about the issue. Two, we thought about how do we reframe this conversation so that it's not about blaming someone, being hesitant, but rather looking at questions of equity and access, which is really what the conversation was about, and really reframing that conversation. And three, in making our grant making decisions, which we did a lot of pooled funding around, it was really about putting resources in the hands of those who were on the front lines and knew best what strategies made sense. It wasn't about taking a step back and developing some perfected strategy that we could roll out with a blog post with 5 million over X years, you know, that would take forever and would not respond to this moment in time that needed immediate response. And so to me, it's a great illustration of respect for the ecosystem, because it invited all of us to get out of our narrow little boxes and to think about this issue in a collective way and in a way that was ultimately going to produce impact. And the way we produced impact was to get money into the hands of people on the front lines who knew how to address this issue.
Great example. Great example. Thank you. Kofi or Ann, anything you want to add?
Yeah, for me, just kind of more broadly, it's important, I think, to understand the broader implications of what you do or fail to do, because we are interconnected. We kind of tend to frame things in logic models and all these kinds of things, which is a way for us to kind of grapple with complexity, but it's not really the way the world works more broadly. So to me, this enables one to be a little bit more reflective and think about, is what we're doing harmful, right? So I think this idea kind of it's almost like a Hippocratic oath for the sector is, start with do no harm, right? And then focus on how you can do some good by trying to fulfill the purpose. And I think when you think about purpose, it actually opens one up to think more collaboratively, because you're not thinking competitively anymore. You're not thinking about institution building and branding and those kinds of things. You're trying to figure out how you can actually try to help create an environment to make it possible to achieve the purpose, which inevitably, I think, leads you to think about how you can work with others.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think that the combination of the two first principles of purpose first and ecosystem awareness get at the idea of connection and sort of going deeper into understanding of why are we here as an organization or an institution in a way that allows you to actually see the connections to others that might not be visible if you're sitting at the mission statement or existing strategies and tactics level, which focus a little bit more on distinctions from other instead of connection to other. And so I would say that it is seeing that place and that connection that then opens up, as you're saying, Kofi, different ways of thinking about collaboration and partnership and, collective innitness, which is not the same as not having, specific philanthropic goals or not having a specific mission and role, which is some of the pushback that we've heard is, this is asking me to be all things. It isn't. But when you go deeper into yourself and understand why you're there, you can see the ways that you are related to others.
Hey, Phil, you are a great moderator, but I'm going to invite you out of that moderating role because you also have a lot of content to offer to this conversation. So you sit in a lot of foundation boardrooms, you observe foundations, all this talk that we're having right now about the need to be collaborative, all these issues that we aspire to, what gets in the way?
Well, I appreciate the question. And I was just thinking that there is a tension here between the push to evaluate and understand our impact. What difference are we, the XYZ Foundation, making? Which is not to say I'm arguing against trying to understand how you're doing, because it's really important. But the framing of how are you doing? How is who doing? Is it just us, or is it a bigger kind of unit of assessment? There is obviously also, so that's one challenge. Another is the inevitable careerism that exists for any professionals, right? The desire to be known as a leader of a foundation that did this, a board member of a foundation that did that. And, related, maybe to the first two, is just, you want to be accountable. That's a good thing. You want to be accountable. Well, when you want to be accountable, then you look to things like, well, okay, we are a board. How are we holding the CEO accountable? And then you can go down the path pretty quickly to some inputs into the CEO evaluation process that would pull you away from the purpose-driven and collaborative approach, and more to the, again, what did you do? How many op-eds did you have? And that kind of counting of media hits, or trying to ascribe credit to a particular individual or institution. So those are some thoughts.
Thank you. I would just point to the incredible work of Janeway Skillern, who's one of the thinkers that I credit with some of the early formation of this thinking, who's done amazing work around networked leadership and what it takes to be a networked organization. And many of the things that you're highlighting, Phil, are ideas that come to the fore in her work. And I actually wrote a piece years back that was sort of responding to that body of work and asking, what does it mean to govern a collaborative organization? And so many of the things that you're mentioning are things that, I was pointing to as structural challenges with the way that boards traditionally operate and how it does get in the way. So just agreed.
Thank you. Let's talk about the third principle, equity. And Kofi, you were on the Ford Foundation board. I'm not sure if you were chair at the time, but you were at least on the board in a moment in which that foundation shifted its focus to be essentially completely on the issue of inequality. What did you learn in that process? And I guess maybe more relevant for the hundreds of foundation folks listening in, what advice based on that learning would you give a foundation board that was seeking to put equity more at the center of their work?
Okay, so I think that shift was made possible because we had gone through a particularly intensive time. We had gone through a presidential search. There'd been a kind of recruitment of a senior leadership team, and we'd spent a lot of time reflecting on what I would call purpose. Like why are we here? I think that process led to a real partnership that was really strong, really candid also, right, between the executive leadership team and the board. So we were really able to have really good conversation that was really productive. People could, there was a trusting environment, right? So you could say things and people knew it was coming from a good place. You were just trying to understand. And I think that a shift like that is very hard to do unless you really have that really strong alignment and really kind of a deep trust between the leadership team and the board. So I would say that was a really key thing. The other thing is that it caused us to really challenge a lot of our own practices, because you're saying inequality, putting inequality at the center of everything. What is it that you do as an organization, right, that is inconsistent with that? Turns out there are quite a lot of things. And we try to address as many as we can. I'm sure the board is still working on things, but if you say this is what you want to put at the center, then you got to look at your board first, right? You got to look at your hiring practices, the way you behave, the way you interact. Got to look at lots of things. And so it's not something that you can do without that deep partnership and without a willingness to really be self-critical and try to model the behavior that is consistent with the approach you're taking.
That's great. And, I'm thinking as you're talking, Kofi, about this worry I've had about, it's been obviously really gratifying to see foundations focus more explicitly on racial equity, but the worry that sometimes that is done as if it's this thing over here, without then saying, okay, but in our programmatic focus in the environment, how are we addressing issues of systemic racism that result in disproportionate exposure to toxins for people of color? Or in our education strategy, when we read it, it doesn't even mention race, and yet there is so much, whether you look at school discipline or other data that suggests that there is systemic racial inequity in education. And so how do you integrate it, really into these strategies? Jim, I know you've wrestled with this issue and also its relationship to governance. What do you want to offer?
Yeah, I think what I would offer is, as many foundations have done coming out of this last year, there have been a lot of statements made about a commitment to racial equity. I think a lot of expressions of support and resources committed. At Barr, we increased our payout by 25% in this year, and explicitly said that the additional resources were explicitly to fund additive work focused on racial equity. So to your point, Phil, this was to fund work within programs. So it wasn't about shifting resources. We were going to continue our programmatic goals, but there would be other ways to build in more activity that's additive in nature, that builds on our current strategies, but really express this commitment to racial equity. And I think that's important. I would come back to what Kofi said, though, which I think is really important. We were fortunate in that we actually started some of these conversations about equity and racial equity several years ago with our board. And I think in some ways we were fortunate for that, because in some ways I felt that foundations that had not done that kind of work and then were faced with the reckoning we dealt with last year, I think were also in a remote context. It was hard to then create the space and the shared vocabulary, shared understanding that you need to have in order to make these kinds of commitments. So Kofi's point that this is a process, it requires trust, it requires alignment. That takes time, and it's an ongoing journey, and that's what we are in. And we're going to talk a little bit about board issues in our own institution in a moment. But I would just say that this notion of recognizing it takes time, it doesn't happen overnight, is really important. And again, comes back to the point about Anne's article that this is an evolutionary set of work.
Thank you. Okay, I want to take us, Anne, unless you want to weigh in on this, I want to take us to that fourth principle and back to you again, Jim, and you already alluded to it in terms of, this question of authorized use of voice and power. You came to the Barr Foundation as CEO and trustee, joining a board of just two others, the donors, Amos and Barbara Hostetter. So how have they and you grappled with this issue, and how have they decided the board should evolve as a result of that thinking?
This, to me, was probably one of the most important tasks that I had arriving at the Barr Foundation now, as Phil noted a moment ago, 7 years ago, just yesterday. And it was clear that early on, Barbara and Amos and I together needed to make some fundamental decisions about what the future of the board and the governance of the institution was going to look like. And interestingly enough, we made a decision that we were going to do that work together and by ourselves. We weren't going to bring in a consultant. We were essentially going to sit in a room together over a period of multiple months and have an iterative discussion about how we saw the governance of the foundation needing to evolve, given the fact that this was going to evolve from a family foundation to more of a legacy foundation. And some of the decisions that came out of that summer of 2014 were pretty profound. It included a decision that the board would eventually grow to have a majority of non-family members, And in effect, the non-family members would have the control of the foundation, and this was explicit. It included the decision to provide the board with very broad latitude. There would be nothing written in any charter that would require that we stay focused on Boston, that would require that we focus in these particular areas, that would require that we, again, that we sort of stay focused in particular regions. And there was not even any expectation of perpetuity, very important as well. Instead, the decision was made, those are decisions that future generations of trustees will be best equipped to make based on the circumstances that they face. The one issue the founders cared about were the values of the foundation, and a lot of work and effort has gone into expressing those. And I think values around humility, values around curiosity are ones that they hope will always remain part of the DNA of the Barr Foundation. Today, we are now a board of 7. We continue to be in the process of growing the board. The board is 4 non-family, 3 family members. Over time, the board will likely grow to somewhere between about 11 and 15 trustees, probably a proportion of 1/3 family to 2/3 non-family. But even there, the expectation will be family members who join the board join not because they have a family name, but because they meet the qualities and criteria that any board member would meet in terms of the kinds of skills and attributes. And in recruiting board members, we thought really intentionally about bringing people with different perspectives, different experiences. Diversity has been a key consideration for us. The board is now 3 of the 4 non-family members are people of color, and that's explicit. And we continue to work on that as we recruit. And in fact, we'll be adding another board member later this year. So it's been a very thoughtful process, and it's been intentional. And it takes time. But I think to the very point that ties back to the article, it is that body that then provides that authorizing voice for the work of the institution. So thinking carefully about the composition, the chemistry, and the attitude that that group brings to its board governance is really critical.
It may not be fashionable in this moment to give a lot of credit to major individual donors, but Barbara and Amos's decision to have the board evolve in the way that it has, I think, is inspiring. And I hope that obviously folks have to wrestle with their own decisions, but I hope that can provide some inspiration to others. I think that's really, really great. Kofi, and then I'm going to invite Ann back in as we turn to questions, and please keep the questions coming in the Q&A. Kofi, any thoughts on this issue of authorized use of voice and power?
Yeah, it's a pretty fraught question, and I think that foundations have to be really, really careful with use of voice, and really, really humble about. It's inevitable. I mean, because you have resources and networks as a foundation, you do have power, right? In relative terms, and I think it really has to be something that one really thinks about how it advances the purpose. And to me, if you can't really see that it's really essential to the purpose, you should probably step back, in my view, because it changes conversations in ways that one can't really predict. But there are organizations that have done this very, very well. And then there are some that I think, despite their best intentions, it's been counterproductive. So this is something that I think one really should do a lot of work around purpose, including, board composition and all these things, before one really gets too heavily into that.
Thank you, Kofi. Want to start to turn to questions from the audience. Before I do that, though, Ann, as you're listening to Jim and Kofi, who are obviously bringing a foundation perspective, what reflections do you have about the discussion and the way your article is being interpreted and talked about?
I'm just so appreciative for the conversation and eager to hear what questions folks have on their minds as they come into our conversation with us. I guess the one thing that I would add, and Jim, I so appreciate you bringing it back to the idea of evolution and sort of iterative change that can build on itself, is as I think about what you were just saying, Kofi, I think that my hope is that as boards move and lean into a purpose-driven approach, they actually start to see that different things are possible as a result of how they have changed. And so to that point around use of voice, very different voice at the beginning of what might be a change process than the end, and thinking about sort of what you're pointing towards in terms of who you want to be and what that requires of you in terms of your own change, I think is a good future focused conversation and North Star as boards think about taking those first steps.
Anne, I have a question here for you that I thought was interesting. So most of the folks on this webinar probably know BoardSource. Maybe some know BoardSource less well, but we at CEP use BoardSource's board self-assessment on a every 2 to 3 year cycle. Many nonprofits do, many foundations do. You provide other kinds of services for boards. As you have thought about what BoardSource offers, I guess to what extent will that shift as a result of this piece that you've written, or is this really the culmination of thinking that has already been sort of captured in the resources that you offer? Is this changing the direction of the organization, or was the organization already going in this direction?
So I think it's sort of a both, and we have changed a lot over our first 30 plus years of existence. And I think probably the biggest shift in this most recent decade is really going from being primarily a provider of services and resources to being much more of a blend between research and thinking and resources to sort of support changes in practice. And that shift, I think, is what has us much more centered on what is the future of governance, what is happening in our macro context, and what does that require of boards. And so it's those organizational shifts and really our reflection about our core purpose that created the space for us to do thinking like this. So in some ways, it's the culmination, as you asked. But I think for us, we are now asking ourselves, and have been for some time, what does this mean in terms of all of the other things that we do and what we do next? And so, we have for many, many years been deeply committed to centering racial equity in our work and diversity, inclusion, and equity more broadly. The sort of nexus of purpose-driven board leadership and the urgent need for diversity, inclusion, and equity change at the board level is really what we're focused on from a leadership and a research perspective. And thinking about how we're learning and experiencing and thinking about needs to be transformed or embedded into all of the practical supports that we offer is, a curve that we're still on. So that, of course, has started, but there's a lot more to be done.
Thank you. There's a lot of interest in the questions in response, I think, to what Jim described about Barbara and Amos Hostetter, but also some of the questions that I think came in even before your comments, Jim, about how do you talk to a living donor or a family board about this evolution. I'm reading between the lines of some of the questions a little bit, but part of it might be, how do you do that when part of what is really being advocated for here might involve some diffusion of their level of control or influence? What are the arguments that one can mount effectively. Any thoughts from any of you about the best approach?
I'm happy to start and would just say that I think the way Anne framed her article is the answer to that question, which is if you approach it from the mindset of how do we think about sort of this family foundation and composition and evolution of governance and next generation engagement. In other words, if you're thinking of it with kind of the mindset of the institution being a family foundation, that will lead you down a certain set of paths in terms of the kind of conversation you're going to have. And even to pick up on your point, Phil, it could even lead you to a point of kind of, okay, how do I make a case? How do I argue for something? If instead you think about what is it that we want this institution to do? What is the impact that we want this organization to have? What is the purpose of our existence? That then invites you to have a conversation about, okay, if this purpose, which hopefully is something exciting and energizing, is expressed, how is it that the composition of the people around this table making smart, informed, thoughtful decisions toward that end, how is it that changing the composition of that group, broadening it, bringing different perspectives and experiences is actually going to make for a richer outcome in terms of our ability to contribute to that goal? So I would say, again, Anne's framework provides a lovely response to how you think about something as narrow as kind of how do we think about sort of shifting the discussion around the family foundation and how do we get other voices? I would say go back to what's your purpose? What are you really trying to do? What's the difference you're trying to make in the world?
Thank you. Let's talk about more broadly than just the family dynamic question, who's on the board? And that's coming up in the questions as well. Is it okay to have grantees on the board? How do you deal with that? My own perspective is to sometimes not be sure that I can understand why certain folks are on foundation boards, right? Where there seems to be, I appreciate what lawyers and investment bankers bring to the table, and yet probably a board shouldn't be only lawyers and investment bankers. And as we've looked, at who's on foundation boards, and Kofi, of course, is smiling because was a practicing attorney for many years. But it seems to be what is underrepresented often is kind of close to the community impacted expertise, knowledge of philanthropy or nonprofits. Can you all talk a little bit about that?
I'm happy to start off. So I think that I agree with Jim that Anne's framing is really useful for this. But so to me, the family versus legacy, I saw there was a question in the chat asking what the difference is. In my mind, a family foundation is one that is controlled by the family, and a legacy is one that's, an independent kind of self-perpetuating group, right? They pick people to come join them from time to time. And I'm not sure that whether you're a family foundation or whether you're a legacy foundation is really the important question to look at. I think that really addressing the purpose question is the way to go. I don't, what I've been reading about and hearing from Jim in terms of the Barr Foundation, this came from the donors, right? Who have had really, really thoughtful, engaged discussions with Jim and others, and this is the way they think. They feel this is the best way to go forward. So if you're at an organization that is a family foundation, I think this is a process that I think it's the wrong way to go about it is to argue in terms of whether one should be family or legacy, one should really focus on the purpose and how's best to get there. And I think I can see a family foundation working well and really doing a good job around purpose and building in voices. At the Ford Foundation, there was a tradition of actually including grantees on the board, and I believe the reason is that you want those voices. So the grantees were ones that had kind of stable relationships, right, with the foundation, were really kind of key key organizations in their sectors that were kind of long-term in the plans of the foundation to support. And it was really, really useful to hear their perspective. And everybody knew where they were coming from. But they also thought about their role as a trustee, just the way everybody else did. I think for a lot of the kind of work the Ford Foundation supports, it's really important to have those voices in the room. And they do have an impact on things like payout, right? They are, they see how urgent things are today. And they're a counterbalance to people who kind of maybe want to cut back a little bit more. And it's useful to have that open debate in a boardroom.
All I would add to that is, I think, again, I just want to tie it back to Anne's article. I think, Anne, your, again, invitation around looking at the ecosystem and your role in the ecosystem. I think an interesting question for all of us is, how do our boards kind of represent that ecosystem as we see it? The ecosystem that we seek to be a part of, how is it that we ensure that that board table sort of brings those different perspectives and voices and experiences, lived experiences?
And
I would
thoughts on
just
that?
I would add that a board's composition, really whether you see it that way or not, it is an expression of whose perspectives the organization or institution believes are important to have at the decision-making table. And so asking the question through that lens and, through the frame of, we say this is our purpose, who do we need to have to be able to make good, well-informed decisions in support of that purpose, is the way to think about board composition.
And Kofi alluded to the importance of healthy tension and difference of opinion, right? And we haven't really talked much today about the dynamic within the boardroom and how, and Jim, you've written about this, and you've written about it, facilitating a climate or culture in which it is okay to disagree, and in which, rather than a sort of culture of politeness in which the real issues don't get surfaced. And given how much work you've done, any thoughts on that part of this?
So just to make sure I'm hearing the question, like how to deliberate in ways that don't require uniformity in opinion, but do get to purpose-driven decisions.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not easy. So I don't have a quick answer there, but I think that what you're pointing to is really important. That it can't be that we all have to think the same thing to be a strong board. I think diversity of perspective is incredibly important. I think the way that I would sort of characterize that, though, is you do have to have some sense that you're in the same neighborhood of what that purpose is, because that should be the North Star that you can come back to as a group. And if you don't agree about the reason that the organization exists, roughly, I think that is too broad of perspective. And so that should be the organizing principle in terms of how are we thinking about who should or maybe should not be on this board. And that if you are organized in that way, there should be lots of space for diversity of perspective within and under that banner.
Thanks, Sam. All right, I want to
actually. I just want to add one,
and I want to add to that too.
I think so. Temperament is important, right? If you have people with the right temperament, ones that can sit around a round table, right, and can have different perspectives, but temperamentally they're suited to really engage with a broader group, because no one board member has any power, right? It's a collective. So I think one has to really think about temperament when one thinks about board composition, that's to me, if you don't have people with the right temperament, you get dysfunction, and it actually leads to negative reinforcement. The voices that you're trying to bring in actually don't get heard, right, or aren't effective at getting heard, and that can be a real problem on the board. So lots of diversity of viewpoint, lots of room to debate issues, but you need to have the right temperament for board service.
I echo that, and I would quickly add, I also think those of us in the chief executive role need to be asking ourselves, how do we shift from a dynamic where we often talk about managing our boards to a dynamic where we talk about engaging our boards? Because it's in asking ourselves that question that the way in which we work with the board and the way in which the board works with each other shifts from one that's about pageantry and show and tell and look at how great everything is, to one that's about genuine discussion, engagement in generative work that's about the work of the institution. And I remember something very wise. Steve Schroeder was the former president of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, retired, moved to California, and he joined the board of the James Irvine Foundation very early in my tenure as CEO in 2003. And the best advice he gave me is, he sat down in his first meeting with me one-on-one and said, Jim, if you don't have some 10-2 or 9-3 or 8-4 votes on this board, you're not doing your job. Because that means that you're creating a place where there can be healthy disagreement and people can also move on.
That's great. And I can't tell you how many times I have heard, maybe not using these exact words, boards get described by CEOs and leadership teams as if they are hurdles to get over, which tells you you're really not getting the most out of your board. Let's close with each of you, and let's start with Jim and then Kofi, and give Anne the final word, which I think she deserves. What would be possible if boards made this shift? We've got just a few minutes. So briefly, what might be possible?
I'll just say this. I think, again, the article is really so game-changing in terms of how we think about the role of our boards and the opportunities of our institutions. What I would say, though, is we need to remember the boards set the tone, and it sets the tone for the institution. And I would just ask us to think about two scenarios. If you have a board that is inquisitive, that is curious, that is leaning in. I see Nikki put a comment about white supremacy culture in our boardrooms. You know, a board that's willing to engage in that conversation, that's one dynamic. If you have a board that sees its role as overseeing, as basically managing, as, you know, in some sense being skeptical about what they're seeing and hearing and feeling that their role is to probe, and to your point about impact, to be able to tie impact, those are two very different kinds of boards. And I would argue in foundation settings, and I've seen both, the way the foundation works as a result of each of those kinds of boards is fundamentally different. And until we move from the former to the latter with the kind of advice that Anne has given us, we're not going to be able to change the dynamic and culture of these institutions.
Thank you, Jim. Kofi.
Yeah, I think there's a real opportunity for us with this framing to really improve the effectiveness of organizations, and a way to attract to boards and the right types of voices that can really help inform these discussions. It's really, really difficult for me to imagine how in trying to address this question of purpose, being purpose-driven, there's a whole cascading set of decisions that come from that about how one thinks about who's in the room, how one thinks about the communities that the grantees serve, that you support, and about the role that organizations play as part of a greater community. So, I think this is the next decade. We could really do a lot to really improve, and I think we're all trying very, very hard today, but we're often focusing on the wrong things, and I think this makes it much easier to return to the focus on the right issues.
Thank you, Kofi. Anne.
Yeah, with apologies, I'm not going to exactly answer your question. I'm going to answer a slightly different one.
That's okay.
Because what I think about is not so much what is possible, though I agree that I think a lot is possible with this shift, but I think about what's at stake. And for me, I think that the relevance, the impact, and the trust of the social sector is at stake. And that if we aren't willing to make some really significant shifts so that, a decade from now, as you said, Kofi, we're not looking at similar data points, that all of that is at risk. And so I think about, yes, the opportunity, and I feel incredibly optimistic about boards' ability to transform and change themselves. But I also think about what's at stake if we don't. So that's where I would end.
Thank you. That's powerful. And I want to say, just if you allow me just a personal note, that it's been a real privilege to be in conversation with the three of you, three people who I just have enormous respect and admiration for. I think I first met Kofi all of 30 years ago when he was in a role of board member at the institution where we both went to college, and so happy to have stayed connected. And Jim was one of the first people I visited to try to get some support for CEP, and has been so supportive for the last 2 decades. And then Anne, just to thank you for this article, which is a gift to the sector and to all of us, and for your friendship. Anne and I, just let our little secret out, have been like sort of pandemic crisis organizational leader buddies with monthly Zooms, usually with glass of wine in hand, to just try to help each other navigate this time as leaders of nonprofits that have some things in common. We at CEP are huge admirers of BoardSource. We very much appreciate BoardSource doing the work related to this webinar. So thanks, Anne, not just to you, but to your whole team. And also a thank you to the folks at CEP who coordinated on our end. Finally, thanks to all of you for joining. Really appreciate you making the time to be a part of this conversation, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.